Hello and welcome to 5-Minute Math. Today we are looking at the Algebra 1 concept of identifying functions. This is standard A.12A in the great state of Texas, and we are using item number 36 of the 2016 released STAAR test. If you haven't done so already, please go ahead and take a moment to pause the video, work this problem out on your own, unpause it, and we will look at our answers together. So we need to find a table that represents y as a function of x. It's not going to be very helpful, though, if we don't have a good definition of what a function is. This, unfortunately, is not going to be available on your mathematics chart or your reference materials. You're going to need to know what a function is before you walk into the STAAR test. Thankfully, we started dealing with this back in 8th grade. So if you took 8th grade math as well as Algebra 1, you've got a double dose of it. So what is a function? Well, an easy way to think of it is it's a relationship in which each input leads to one and only one, and that's the key, output. So what do we mean by input and output? Well, if we're talking about inputs, hopefully we're thinking independent variables. And these can take a few different forms, right? But most of the times we think of them as our x values. Sometimes you get a problem situation where you don't have an x and y, you have an r or a t or something like that. So you have to identify what the independent variable is. But for our purposes, especially if we're going to graph it, right, we would always view it as the x-axis, okay? And then it leads to one output. So if our input is going to be our independent variable, then our output is going to be our dependent variable. And in this situation, it is the y, but sometimes it's not always going to be the y. It might be the f of x, or the g of x, or the h of x. And if you get that right, then that automatically tells you it is a function. And so when we're talking about these independent and the dependent variable values, if you can ever find a situation in which it's graphed, right, it's easy to tell because you can do something called, on a graph, a vertical line test. Because what we're doing is we're wanting to make sure, all right, every x value only leads to one y value. And so we draw these vertical lines on the graph, and as long as that vertical line, that line that represents that x value only touches the graph once, we're good to go. But if for some reason the graph is bunching up on itself and it kind of doubles back like this, you see how this vertical line would hit the graph at least 3 times? And that would definitely not be a function because it needs to only hit the graph once. So if we were just to do a basic parabola like that, then that would be a function because it's only hitting each vertical line one time. Now, we don't have a graph here. So what do? Well, we've got tables. What we can do here is we can take a look at our x values. Does each input lead to one output? So I've got a -5, and it leads to a -5, and I'm scanning down here. Take a look at this. I've got a -5 that leads to a -5, and a -5 that leads to 5. So if I were to graph this, right, let's graph it right here. I've got my -5. So I've got a -5 that leads to -5 and a -5 that leads to +5. Does not pass the vertical line test because I have one input, -5, that leads to 2 different y's, 2 different outputs. Okay, and if I take a look at my g, I've got a 6 and -6, but those are 2 different ones. I've got an 8 and -8, so I don't have any repeats there. So that's looking pretty good. I can graph all of those. I'm not going to get anything that breaks the vertical line test. Hopefully we see on h, I've got a -3 that leads to -4. I've got a -3 that leads to +4. So same thing. I've got a -3 and I can hit my -4, +4. It doesn't pass the vertical line test. Neither does this. Look, I've got my 1s. 1s do the same thing. So it fails the vertical line test twice, and then there's j. Let's just map everything onto. Yeah, that's not going to work because it fails the vertical line test all the different ways. So my answer here is going to be G.